Good evening. My name is Michelle Moyd, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society and Associate Professor in the History Department at Indiana University, Bloomington. I want to thank you all for joining us for the Confronting Racism series. We're in week 5 of the 7-week program, which is streaming live on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. on Facebook. Tonight, we're talking about social justice and incarceration, and we're delighted to bring you an exciting lineup tonight. This series was inspired by the recent and ongoing nationwide protests against police violence and systemic racism, and in support of Black lives. We wanted to foster conversations about the histories and social realities of race, racism, and anti-Blackness in the US, and to explore the modes of protest, resistance, and rebellion used to confront these thorny issues. We know that racism is entrenched in our histories, institutions, policies, and practices, and that it remains pervasive today. And we hope that this series can shed some light on one of the most urgent and important issues of our time. Over the past few weeks, we've brought together experts in the arts, humanities, and social sciences to discuss a host of topics, including media, technology and social media, protest and social change, policing, and the urban geographies of violence. And in the upcoming weeks, we can look forward to conversations on Indigenous perspectives and finally, global solidarities. This series is a collaborative effort between Indiana University Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, the Arts and Humanities Council, and the College Arts and Humanities Institute, and is supported by the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and the Public Humanities Project. I especially wanted to recognize Ed Komentale, Dina Okamoto, Deb Cohn, Joe Highland, Gerard Panikek, and the ANH and CREST staff for all helping to put this program together. This week, we're also delighted to present this event in partnership with the Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. Before going further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University was built on Indigenous homelands and recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. I'd also like to take a moment to offer a short definition of race, especially as we've learned, as people have been watching the series, that people are beginning to think about using these discussions in their teaching. Race has been one of the most powerful and persistent group boundaries in American history, distinguishing between the experiences of those classified as non-white from those classified as white, with often significant consequences, devastating for some, uplifting for others. Race is not biological, but it is a concept and ideology developed during the late 17th century alongside the establishment of African slavery as the dominant unfree labor regime in the Americas. As the idea of race evolved, white superiority took on the trappings of common sense, and it became widely accepted as a social ordering principle. Not only did it serve as a justification for slavery, but also for the extermination of indigenous peoples, the exclusion of Asian immigrants, and the seizure of Mexican lands. Racial practices were institutionalized within US policies and the larger society, and as a result, race became an important mechanism for limiting and restricting access to privilege, power, and wealth. So now I'd like to just do a couple of introductions before I hand things over to tonight's moderator. Tonight's program was organized by Adam Hens. Adam is a research associate with the Center on Education and Lifelong Learning at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University, Bloomington. Hens is currently a doctoral candidate in the Literacy, Culture, and Language Education Department at Indiana University, and he is also the director of The Power of a Sentence, a writing workshop series at the Indianapolis Women's Prison. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight's program. Dr. Brooke Harris-Garrod is Assistant Research Scientist with the Center on Education and Lifelong Learning at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University, Bloomington. Harris-Garrod is also the chair of the Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at IIDC. Teacher education is at the heart of Harris-Garrod's research and teaching background, In addition to teaching and conducting research in traditional, informal, and non-formal learning environments, Harris Garad has worked as a teacher educator in New York City and Djibouti in East Africa, an English instructor in Grenoble, France, and an online English teacher for elementary school age children in China. And we are so glad that she is here to help us lead this discussion tonight. And with that, I look forward to the discussion and to your questions in Facebook after the panelists have all spoken.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Michelle. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's event as we take up the topic of social justice and incarceration. Even within this series, tonight's panel is unique in that we have brought together an all-Black panel comprised of folks doing work within and beyond the Academy. Together, their perspectives will enable us to deepen our understanding of how Indiana and our own communities and institutions fit within a national conversation about the movement for Black lives. This panel represents a challenge to my fellow academics in Indiana to center local voices and stories, to say the names of the brothers and sisters we've lost in our own cities, like Drayshawn Reed and Eleanor Northington, among others, and to examine the effects of incarceration and policing within our Black communities here in Indiana. As an educator and a representative of the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, I am specifically listening for how to take this topic back to the teachers and youth I work with. I challenge our listeners to actively participate tonight, then to dig deeper into the work of our panelists, both through their press and publications, and to continue to learn from them beyond the event. We will begin with presentations from each of the panelists as they tell us how their work relates to or intersects with the topics of social justice and incarceration. We will then have an opportunity for follow-up questions and group discussion. And before we end our time together, the panelists will have an opportunity to answer questions from our Facebook viewers. Now, among other things, because each of the panelists is talented on many fronts, I want to say that Michael Harriet makes me cry laughing with his humor and insight. Clint Smith drops the kind of poetic gems that make you ruminate for days. And Leah DeRay and Kyra J, on a more personal level, are community-oriented change makers that I want my daughters to emulate. This panel is Black excellence, and we are in for a dynamic discussion tonight. So without further ado, I invite our first speaker, Clint Smith, to take the mic. I'm going to introduce him. Clint Smith is a writer, teacher, and the author of Counting Dissent, which won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. Clint has received fellowships from New America, the Art for Justice Fund, Cave Canem, the National Science Foundation, and his writing has been published in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Poetry Magazine, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. He currently teaches writing and literature at the DC Central Detention Facility. His debut nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, which explores how different historical sites reckon with, or fail to reckon with, their relationship to the history of slavery, will be published by Little Brown in 2021. He received his BA from Davidson College and his PhD from Harvard University. Thank you, Clint.
Thank you so much, Brooke. It is a pleasure to be here and to share the space in this panel with Michael, Leah, and Kyra. And I can't wait to hear what they have to say. I won't speak for too long about on this because I want to hear so much from the other panelists, but just to sort of ground the conversation and for folks to understand my relationship the topic at hand. So I just graduated from my doctoral program in May. And in my doctoral research, I studied the relationship between education and incarceration. And so I've been teaching in prisons and jails for the past 6 or 7 years, previously in Massachusetts when I lived there, and more recently in Washington, D.C., now that I live in this area. And part of what has become very clear to me, the more time that I've spent teaching in incarcerated spaces, and something that I've become more acutely aware of every single time that I go in, is that but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, I very easily could be someone who was inside of prison rather than somebody who gets the opportunity to walk in and out of that prison each week. And I think that people forget how the prisons exist and are predicated on the idea of social and physical isolation. And so the people who are incarcerated are meant to exist in these far off places. We are not made to think of them. And if we are made to think of them at all, we are made to think of them in sort of caricatures that they've been rendered, these sort of caricatures, these stereotypes of who they are. And we forget that these are our mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and partners and sons and daughters, and everything in between. And I think we forget what it means to be proximate to the folks who are experiencing this in this way. And so for me, that's why I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just studying incarceration, because I think in graduate school, you can sit in the library and read Foucault all day and think about carceral theory. But for me, I really wanted to make sure that I was interfacing and spending time with folks who were experiencing the material harm that incarceration creates in communities across this country every single day. And I know that is what always grounds my scholarship. That is what grounds my writing. That is what grounds my art. I think it is so important for me to be reminded of the stakes of this work. This is not just an intellectual exercise. This is not just something that is meant to just for the sake of exploring or grappling with for the sake of it, but rather this is something that harmfully impacts people every single day. And so my dissertation was on the relationship between education and incarceration, specifically in the context of people who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole. So I spent 2 years in Philadelphia interviewing and spending time with people who had been sentenced to life without parole as children. And so the United States is the only country in the world that formally sentences children to life without the possibility of parole. And in 2016, there was a Supreme Court ruling that made retroactive a 2012 ruling that said that mandatory life without parole for children was unconstitutional. And so what's happened is that you have thousands of, about 2,500 people who were sentenced to life without parole in various states across the country as children, who now had the opportunity to be resentenced. And I had the opportunity to speak with folks who had been in prison for 10, 20, 30, 40, upwards of 50 years for something that they did when they were 16, 17, 18, or rather 16, 17, some as young as 15, 14, and 15. And I was a high school teacher before I went to graduate school. And so it was impossible for me to disentangle my experience as a high school teacher from my experience in having conversations with these folks, because, I taught 10th graders, I taught 14 and 15-year-olds. And the idea that someone would be told that they have to spend the rest of their lives in a cage for something that they did as a child was about as morally repugnant and as runs as counter to any notion of justice that I believe in. And so this is how I spent the last couple of years of my PhD program researching that and thinking about the different ways that education manifests itself inside of prison, and specifically how, when you're told that you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison as a child, what does education mean to you? What motivates you to learn? What motivates you to get a degree? What motivates you to read a poem, to learn geometry, to pursue knowledge for the sake of pursuing knowledge? What's sort of behind that? And I always want to be clear when we're having this conversation, because I am as robust an advocate of prison education programs as anyone you will meet. I mean, what happened there in 1994, we had the crime bill signed by Bill Clinton that sort of decimated the infrastructure of prison education programs across this country, and they've never fully recovered. And so you have really haphazard, scattered programming across different states and different prisons within those states that is not at all consistent and not necessarily offering people in prison the educational opportunities that they should have. but I always want to be clear that, you know, the goal is not to create more prisons with good education programs inside of them, right? Like the goal is not to make it so that people can get college educations in prison and can learn to code in prison so that we can keep those people in prison. I take very seriously the harm that people who are currently incarcerated experience. I think they should have adequate, good, not even adequate, but good medical care, access to good education, access to good legal services, access to good mental health services. But what we have to be clear about is that we cannot use these things to further legitimate the existence of the prison itself. The goal is not to have more prisons with like great healthcare and great education programs. The goal is that we have far fewer prisons in the first place, right? The goal is so that we cut off the pipeline of people going to prison, we cut off the funding going to building more prisons, and that we begin to pull back the power of the carceral state. And so, you know, while to my mind, it is both and, right? It is not, and has never been mutually exclusive. I want people in prison right now to have as best an educational experience as possible. I also want us to stop putting people in prison. And so that is something, sort of caveat that I always have to bring to the space and the conversation around prison education, because it's important to be clear, right? That even if the Trump administration or whatever administration decided to fully reinstate Pell Grants and to make this robust infrastructure of educational opportunities inside of prison, that would not make prison a good place, because prison is not a good place. It's a violent place. It's a horrific place. And it's a place where we put millions and millions of people for things that that are inherently and intrinsically linked to poverty. And we can go on and have more conversations about the relationship of race and poverty to who ends up on the pipeline to prison. But that's a little bit about me, and I can't wait to hear from the other panelists.
Thank you so much. As I promised you, he has such deep things to get us to think so critically. So I look forward to hearing more about what you have to say in the group discussion, Clint. Thank you for your remarks. The next thing I'm going to do is introduce Michael Harriet. Michael Harriet is the senior writer at theroot.com, where he covers the intersection of race, politics, and culture. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and his mother's refrigerator. He is a frequent political commentator on MSNBC and CNN, and earned the National Association of Black Journalists Award for digital commentary, as well as TV writing. Michael earned a bachelor's degree in mass communications from Auburn University and a master's in macroeconomics from Florida State University. His book, Black AF History, will be released in the spring of 2021.
Hey guys. First, hello. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So what I want to start with, I always start with like the reason I am this way, right? So I wasn't like educated in the American, like the normal way people are educated. I was homeschooled. I was kind of like raised by wolves. My mom just threw stuff at me and just said like, tell me what you think about this. And I would go down rabbit holes. So that's how my education system was. And then when I entered into what you call the regular public education system, until to this day, I think that we don't know how much we absorb subconsciously in the way of how it teaches us to think, not what we think, but how it teaches us to think and how we accept information that is given to us. And I say all of that to explain that, like, what people never ask themselves is, like, nobody ever mentions one fact, that prison doesn't work, right? We know that. Every study shows that it doesn't deter people from committing crime. It doesn't, it doesn't reform people who have committed crimes. And when the large majority of people who come out of prison are, they are recidivists. They commit another crime. So prison doesn't work on any level. So we should first start with, that's the number one reason, regardless of race or color or, the American history of incarceration, the first thing you should know is that prison doesn't work, just doesn't. Second thing I always tell people is that we get this notion that prison is racist or incarceration is racist. And I always like to distinguish between racism and white supremacy. Like what we're talking about is white supremacy, not racism. Racism is individual. It's a feeling. It's a thing that no one could ever figure out. You can't tell if someone's racist because, unless someone invents a stethoscope that can listen to the racism in your heart, you'll never know if anyone is racist. And it really doesn't matter to Black people. Black people would be content with people being racist if they treated us equally. We wouldn't care what was in people's heart, right? But what we're talking about is white supremacy, the system that gives some people a better chance at opportunity, at success than other people because of the color of their skin. And those people are white people. That's why white supremacy is what we're talking about, not racism, because there's no way to destroy or disactivate racism. We can't legislate it away, but we can legislate out and we can dismantle white supremacy because it is a system. And prison is a white supremacist institution. So, one of the most annoying examples of this is that if a Black person, studies show this now, if a Black person and a white person commit a crime and they have the same criminal history, a judge, just a random judge, will sentence the Black person to 20% longer prison term than a white person. Now, it is impossible to tell if those judges hate white people, but because that is a statistic that is prevalent throughout the prison system, we can say that that is white supremacy. And we like to think of white supremacy, oftentimes we talk about it in a way like a white supremacist is a super racist, but that's not true. White supremacy is that system, right? So another thing we know about prison is that in every part of the incarceration system or the criminal justice system is tilted against Black. Now, there are a number of factors. Some of it is poverty. The criminal justice system is very dependent on money. And a lot of times poor Black people don't have the same criminal defense as white people do. One of the things I always ask about that is no one ever asks, again, well, why so many Black people poor? They'll say, well, no, it's not racism, it's poverty. But then they don't ask the follow-up question. Well, why so many Black people so much poor? We know that the Black people who were here since slavery literally built the economy that this country rests on, right? Like America enjoyed, whether it's 89 years, if you count from 1776, or you count from 1619 and you go to 246 years, right? We enjoyed however many years of free labor. And so it can't be that Black people are lazy, right? It can't be that in a country that supposedly rewards hard work and ingenuity, it can't be that, right? So what is it? If it is poverty, then why are Black people so much poorer, right? So this is the way that I like to talk about incarceration, the criminal justice system, because it is hard to convince someone with opinions, right? Much of my opinion is formed as a person who studied macroeconomics by a large-scale view of facts, because to dismantle this system, you're going to have to do it systematically, right? Like you can't take apart a bicycle with a hammer. You need a screwdriver and you have to kind of know how bicycles work, right? So that is the work that I try to do in the space of criminal justice, and especially when it relates to incarceration. I think the important thing to know is, one, that it doesn't work if we started from now. Like the thing that I always challenge people to do is to start from now. If you started right now in 2020 and built a system of criminal justice that either punished or tried to revitalize people who committed crimes, would you start with the system that we have now? And if your answer is no, then why not tear it apart? Why not get the screwdriver at least and try to learn how it works? Because to not do so is to perpetuate the white supremacy that we exist, the white supremacist systems that we exist in now. Because every second that we don't take a screwdriver to the system, we are tacitly giving approval to its existence, right? Because in a democracy, we control it. Our tax dollars pay for that system. Our votes vote for the politicians who write the laws, who put that place people in that system. So we have to start from the place where we understand how this system works. We have to know what to call it, and then we got to know what we want to do going forward. If we were to start now and try to eliminate prison, if you are a prison abolitionist, well, the first thing you would do is start early. And you would start with education, you would start with mental health, and you would start with poverty. But you couldn't start with any of that until you acknowledge that Black people have less access to health, mental health, Black people have get worse education, and Black people have less access to wealth and money in America. So you can't talk about prison, you can't talk about criminal justice, you can't talk about America's system of incarceration without talking about, not racism, white supremacy. And that's the work I do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Michael. Y'all should see me over here scribbling notes, so many things I can't wait to talk about when we get to have our group discussion. So thank you so much for your thought-provoking remarks, Michael.
Thank you.
The next thing I'm going to do is introduce our speakers who are going to co-present. We have Leah and Kyra, and I'm going to read your bios and then give the mic to you, okay? Leah DeRay, she uses the pronouns she, hers. She's an award-winning organizer and is the co-founder of Indy 10 Black Lives Matter. She has dedicated the last 6 years to housing and environmental justice, youth-focused social justice initiatives, and community building. Born in Marion, Indiana, and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, Leah attributes her passion for others to her mother, a teacher who regularly opened her heart and Leah's eyes to meeting and exceeding people's basic needs with dignity. Leah's passion for people is actualized through her professional and academic work as an organizer with Homes for All Indy and as a recipient of the Sam Mazarakia Scholarship that will support her schooling in Africana Studies and Civic Leadership. Leah is the manifestation of love and believes loving people fully and laboring with love will sustain us all in liberation. Next, Kyra J., also she, hers, is an award-winning community organizer and co-founder of Indy 10 Black Lives Matter. In the last 6 years, she has led community efforts in ending cash bail, police transparency and abolition, and community building with local schools and universities. Born in Lincoln, Illinois, and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, Kyra understands the unique needs of the communities Indy 10 serves and believes that access to resources and support can revolutionize how residents engage each other, both locally and globally. Kyra's passion and labor for liberation can be summed up by Angela Davis. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept.
Thank you so much. We are so honored to be here.
Shout out Jessica Louise, our friend, for writing those bios, because she made us sound wonderful.
So we can start off talking about Indy 10, if you want to go, since you are the Ferguson girl.
Yeah, so the way we began this work was 6 years ago. We were young 20-somethings who were upset about the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and then Michael Brown. And so actually I went through a breakup. I was lonely. I felt like my world had been turned upside down, and I didn't like that. So I wanted to focus my efforts back on community and there was a vigil for Mike Brown, so I went. And then there was some people who were just like, hey, who wants to go down to Ferguson? And so I said me. I was off that day. But one Saturday, a week after Michael Brown had been killed, we took first aid kits, water and food, and we went down there, just some young people who were upset and didn't know what else to do. Once we got down there, we saw that it was community. It wasn't just what the media was presenting. It was a lot of people coming together who were hurting and wanted to figure out how we could make change. We decided to come back here and start an organization. And through that, through just the courage to go down there, we found a community of folk who were willing to support us, a community of elders who were just like, look, you young people are upset, you don't know what you're doing, but this is how we can help. And so 6 years later, my best friend's here, and she's been doing the work with me since the beginning. And so, you know, we grew up in poverty. We grew up seeing all of our friends, brothers go to prison once we graduated high school. We grew up having family members incarcerated. We were raised by single mothers. So we understood racism and white supremacy, but we didn't know how to name it. We didn't have the language for it. And so after starting this work, we became educated. We began to ask questions. And so we learned that almost everything in our everyday lives is informed by white supremacy, including incarceration, including why all the men in our neighborhood, all the boys we grew up with were either shot or sent to jail. And so now we've made ways in our life for us to do the work that we do every day and impact community while also being able to sustain ourselves.
So like Leah said, we have been able to navigate through community and work regular jobs doing community work. Leah works for the Kepler Institute, and I work for the Bail Project. And working through the Bail Project, I've found that we have a bail problem. People who can't afford to get out of jail will sit in jail until they're able to post bond. And these are people who haven't even pled like not guilty or guilty for a crime. And we have a system that says innocent till proven guilty, but people are sitting in jail and haven't been able to go to court, hire lawyers, or even post bond so they can fight their case from a place of freedom. And a lot of people who are affected by the bill is Black and brown people and people who are in poverty. If you have a $500 cash bond, you might be sitting there for 6-7 months until somebody's able to post your bond. And when your bond is posted, then you're on GPS monitoring or at home detention, and then you're charged $13 a day just for a home detention bracelet, and you haven't even been accused of a crime yet. This is just a pretrial. So I noticed with the cash bail, with the Bail Project that a lot of people who I do talk to, they haven't had high school diplomas. They live in single parent households, a lot of drug and mental health issues. And we as a nation, we're supposed to be the greatest country and we're supposed to be the greatest place to live. And we don't have the resources to provide these people who are in prison. And I believe Michael was talking about it earlier, like we don't have the resources and like, what are we here for? What are we gonna do? How are we gonna help these people? Because people who are incarcerated, most of them are mentally ill, most of them people need rehabilitation, and most of those people just need resources. Yeah, talk about CAP.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about when we first started doing Black Lives Matter work, we had people take us under our wing. Some of those people are people I consider my elders right now. Hala Fair, Imhotep Adisa, and Pambana Luishi, people who work at the Kepler Institute, a community organization that has been dedicated to changing the lives of predominantly Black and brown young men and women in the city. They took us in and they asked us some questions, and they knew we didn't know what we were talking about, but they kept picking our brains until we found the answers. And I've been working with them for about 6 years now, and the work that I do now with the Kepler Institute is called Homes for All. And the Homes for All is a national campaign, a part of the Rights in the City campaign, where we try to figure out ways to make sure that people all people are housed, all people are homes, and that have homes, and that tenants' rights. People who are tenants who rent have rights. People who live in an area that's currently being gentrified are able to try to push back against gentrification. And so we know that people who were formerly incarcerated are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general population. And because of that, we need to have radical housing. We need to have housing that's revolutionary and not based off of people's whether you're a felon or not, or whether you can afford to live in this neighborhood. We need to make sure that everyone is able to have a home. So through the work that I do with Homes for All, I'm able to figure out a way to make sure that tenants and people who are low income and very low income have rights in sustainable housing here in Indiana. Indiana is a very tenant heavy and tenant siting state. So we often don't have things that are in favor of low-income people. And so I've been, like I said earlier, raised by a single mother. I've been evicted from housing. I've had to stay in shelters before. So understanding how being unstable, not knowing where you're gonna stay the rest of the night, how that it leads to incarceration, right? Because you're unstable. Who knows what you need to do to pay rent. You might need to do something that could lead to incarceration. So this is all a system, and it's an entanglement of white supremacy. So housing is an important part of the work that I do, because I understand that when you are stable, you have some place to go at night, then the rest of some of the other things that are barriers to a good life, those can be knocked down after you at least have some place to stay and some place you're stable. So, yeah.
And I would say Indianapolis doesn't have any state-funded shelters, so it's very hard for people to if they're getting out, there's nowhere for them to go. A lot of people that I do bail out, they don't have a home, and a lot of people that do try to apply for apartments, felonies, have to be 25 years or older, and that's not realistic for a lot of people. I worked in senior communities where a felony had to be 25 years or older, and some seniors didn't have a felony that it was still under that 25-year mark. So like Leah said, definitely housing plays a major part in people committing crime and going back to jail and reoffending, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Leah and Kyra. Okay, I personally have all kinds of questions for the panelists. So what is going to happen now is we are going to bring everybody back in for an opportunity to have more of a group discussion on a couple of different questions. So I noticed, for example, that each of you mentioned the idea of education. It's not always, what happens in the schoolhouse, but the idea that you might learn from your elders or learning how to name the systems of oppression. So my question for you is, what is the role of education? I'm going to call it social justice education. What is the role of social justice education in the movement for Black lives?
So one of the things, of course, that I would start with is history, right? I don't think you can have an honest conversation about race and the role that it plays in incarceration without knowing that America's system of policing and criminal justice started from slave catching. So, and it really has diverged from there. It's why we have sheriff's office. It started from in South Carolina and in other places in the South. They would deputize men to go catch and punish slaves, not just slaves who escaped, but slaves who they thought needed punishing. And that from that system emerged the draft that we fought the American Revolution in. And then from that system, those people were the people who were drafted into the Civil War. And after the Civil War, those Confederates became our police forces, right? So you have to start from there. And the other thing is, if you're talking about, because when we talk about social justice education, we think of it as in terms of we got to teach people about these liberal progressive issues. But again, when you talk about any system in America, you have to understand the history and you have to understand the economics of it, right? So if we understood, for instance, that the people who are incarcerated for stealing, it costs us more to incarcerate them than the total amount of the things that they stole. Just think about that now, right? Right. So we pay more for the things people stole than what it costs for them to steal them. And we incarcerate about 40% of our prisoners are nonviolent offenders. That's in state prisons, right? So if we saved all of that money by attacking those issues from a different perspective, because again, prison doesn't work, then we could save a lot of money. And it's not about teaching people these progressive values as much as it is an economic issue. They take your money to imprison people, and that is why we don't have the resources for education. That is why we don't have the resources for mental health. That's why we don't have the resources for universal health care, because we spend so much on systems that don't work, and we know they don't work, yet again, we pretend as if we don't have the screwdriver that we need to dismantle them. And all of that starts with education and knowing that these systems don't work.
Yeah, I can build on that. I mean, I think Michael's absolutely right that grounding it can't begin with an understanding of just incarceration, right? Like we have to begin this conversation hundreds and hundreds of years before this. So I always give this timeline because I think it's just helpful in grounding this conversation, and this won't come as news to you all as history scholars, but I think it's just helpful in giving us a sense of like where we were as compared to where we are. So the first enslaved Black people came to the British colonies in what became the United States in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. Civil War ended in 1865. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were signed in 1964 and 1965. The Federal Housing Act was signed in 1968. So it's only been about 50 years in which Black people in this country have even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally legal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, and disenfranchise Black people. Not in an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but like you were a state-sanctioned second-class citizen if you were considered a citizen at all. So if you were to kick somebody for 350 years and then ostensibly stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it will be both morally and intellectually disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why are so many of you incarcerated? Why is there so much violence in your community? Why is there so much poverty in your community? Why is your academic and health and economic outcomes all disproportionately poor relative to your counterparts? But we know the answers to these questions, right? And so I'm working on this book right now, finishing this book that comes out next year about the history of slavery and different historical sites across the country and how they reckon with slavery and failed to. And slavery is one of those things, I think sometimes people can say like, prison is the new slavery. And I'm careful because I don't think that is necessarily accurate. I think that they are two distinct oppressive systems, and we don't have to say that they are the same thing in order to legitimate their oppressiveness. There are things that are like deeply insidious about slavery that are different than what our current carceral state looks like. And I think that we should be precise in naming that. But I do think that it is absolutely important to understand how the history of slavery has shaped the landscape of inequality in this country more broadly, and how that thus shapes what our sort of larger carceral state looks like, right? And slavery is one of those things we tell ourselves was a long time ago, when it in fact wasn't that long ago at all, right? Like my grandfather's grandfather was somebody who was born into slavery. When my son or daughter sits on my grandfather's lap, they're sitting on the lap of someone who sat on the lap of someone who was born into bondage, right? Like, and we know, and as Michael pointed out, like the existence of the United States as a global economic superpower today is inextricably linked from the labor of enslaved Black people over the course of centuries, right? As David Blight, the Yale historian, writes that in 1860, there were 4 million enslaved Africans, enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, right? And so there is no United States as it exists today without slavery. As Ta-Nehisi Coates always says, slavery is not a bump in the road, it was the road, right? Like it is fundamental to who this country is. But we don't even have to go all the way back to slavery, right? If you want to talk about the New Deal is the example I always think about, how the New Deal I was taught was the single greatest catalyst of intergenerational wealth over the course of a century. It is the thing that is responsible for creating the contemporary middle class. It has given millions of people access to home ownership and college degrees and all of these magical middle class things. And that's true. But what's also true, and what Ira Katz-Nelson writes about in When Affirmative Action Was White and his book Fear Itself, talks about how Black people were inherently prevented from having access to the benefits that the New Deal afforded, and specifically Black people in the South, which in the early 20th century is where the majority of Black people live. So Black people didn't have access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, healthcare, GI Bill, union membership, the things that literally created the economic bedrock upon which generations of upward mobility were created. And you very intentionally give it to one group of people and very intentionally don't give it to another group of people. And then people want to act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along the lines that those resources were allotted. And so when you have Black folks disproportionately represented in prison, it is not because of anything that is inherent to Black folks. It is not because of cultural dispositions. It is not because the realities of Black communities are inevitable facets of what it means to be Black. It is because the reason one part of Philly looks one way and another part of Philly looks another way, the reason one part of Indianapolis looks one way and another part of Indianapolis looks another way, the reason one part of DC looks one way and another part of DC looks another way, is not because of the people in those communities, but it's because what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And that feeds into the sort of larger criminalization and carcerality that we experience in Black America and thus in this country writ large.
That was,
Right.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
So what is the role of social justice in education? I always say, like, if we don't bring it down to the ground level, if we aren't educating our communities, then I don't feel like social justice or the Black Lives Matter movement is doing its job, right? So we can sit on panels and we can talk about Foucault and Davis and Coates, but if we aren't bringing it down to the community level and bringing it to a level where people can understand, then I don't feel like we're doing our job, right? We're not saying that people don't understand those concepts, but we aren't breaking it down to like the ground level for people who don't have access to conversations like this, then I don't feel like social justice is doing all it can do, because I don't feel like we can just depend on our educational system, right? To just tell the truth about who we are and where we've been and where we're going. I feel like that's on us to educate our own young people, to educate our elders who might not know, to educate each other. And so I feel like the role, the best thing we can do is to make sure that when we have these conversations, that we always bring it back down to our community. You know, we make it make sense on a local level. And we have to be patient, right? Because everyone's not going to know all these theories and these concepts. And so, you know, someone might be coming into the movement because, you know, they're upset about Black lives. They understand that they don't only need to be upset about the Black cis male life that has been lost. They need to be upset about the Black trans woman who was killed, or upset about the disabled Black person who was killed, you know, and tie it all together, right? So if we are talking about education, if we are talking about social justice, and if we are talking about Black Lives Matter, we need to talk about how we could meet people where they are and how we could make it make sense for our communities and how we can educate people and be patient with them while they're learning these concepts. It's one thing to go after the school system, but I feel like the school system is going to do what it's supposed to do, you know, teach our kids how to be in line with the white supremacist system. But it's our jobs as organizers, as educators, and as activists to make sure that my neighbor knows what I know about voting rights, or they know what's happening with our local politics, or they know what's happening with our food and our public housing, so that we can build a strong front together. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
I think you hit it right on the nose. I would just add that we, in this last couple months, we have, Leah calls them baby activists, and we are learning that we have to be patient because they don't know the stuff that we know, and that we are leading them in this movement, and we're teaching them everything that we know and giving them resources, just things that people didn't give us. Like, we had our elders, but also this was a new movement at the time, so they didn't know what to give, but they told us what to read. So we're just passing the information on. And when we go to these schools, like when we go to middle schools and IPS schools, we're just teaching them what we know. and they understand and they listen, and that's all we can do.
Yeah, that's our favorite part of the work, is talking to these young people who are like straight up off the block, you know, from the neighborhood, who one time we went to a school and we were just talking about people who have been killed in our city by IMPD. And some of the kids was like, yeah, my cousin Andre Green, who was 15, was killed a few years ago, you know, and, you know, for us to bring it down to a place where they can understand, like, this isn't just about George Floyd in Minnesota. This happens here, and you're hurting. So how can we talk about it? How can I give you the language to discuss what happened and why it was wrong, and why we just can't blame ourselves for the position that he was in? It's one thing to say he was a bad child, but what does it look like to name the institution and the structure that put him in the predicament that had him doing what he was doing when he was interacting with the police, you know? So my favorite piece about the work that we do is educating our communities and our young people, so that they can be able to feel like this work is tangible. It's something that they can do, you know.
Especially the people that are overlooked, like the friends. We work with the friends of J. John Reed, and the whole community will overlook them because they're not the scholar kids, or they didn't go to this school. They're just regular kids from the hood, just like me and Leah were. And the government and people, and even the government, will overlook them. So I feel like as our job as leaders is to bring those people in and teach them, like I said, what we know.
Wonderful. Michael or Clint, did you want to respond or add anything to that?
Yeah, I can add something. I absolutely agree. And I think, you know, in my experience as a high school teacher and my experience as a person who works as an educator in prison, I think sometimes people can feel like, oh, if you tell young Black children all of this stuff, you're going to overwhelm them. They're not going to know what to do. It's going to be too much. Like, it's either can be presented as they don't have the intellectual capacity to hold all of that, or it can be like they don't have the emotional capacity to hold all of that, right? But what I found, both in my own experience as a young Black person growing up in this country and as a teacher, I remember when I was a kid and, like, you know, people around me would say like Black on Black crime, or would say like Black people just need to work harder, Black people just need this and this, because those were the messages we were being inundated with as a society, right? And in many ways, it looks different now, but in many ways, in kind of in more insidious ways still now, but definitely when I was growing up. And I remember the sense of anger and confusion and sort of paralysis that I felt, that I knew what these folks were saying was wrong. I knew what the news was saying was wrong, but I didn't have the language and the toolkit with which to explain, not much less to others, but to myself, why it was wrong. And I think part of what happens is when we give young people this history, when we give young people these tools, when we give young people this language to understand that the world around them is a social construction, and thus can be reconstructed and deconstructed and made into something new, and that the conditions of your community is not an inevitability, but it's something that was created, right? And it is not something that you inherently deserve. It is not something that you made yourself. It is, again, reflective of things that have been done to your community generation after generation. And that's not to absolve people of responsibility. That's not to say people don't have agency or don't have free will, but it is to contextualize the decisions that people make, and to understand that, like, if you're a kid growing up and you grow up in a community in which you are like incessantly exposed to violence, incessantly exposed to trauma, incessantly like living from, like, you know, in a food insecure community, I mean, the list goes on and on, that is going to shape the sort of trajectory that you are on and the way that you navigate these spaces. And if no one tells you that, like, that's not your fault, you start to think it is, right? And you start to think this is just how it is in certain parts of whatever city, this is just how it is in our community, and not having the language and tools to push back and say, this actually isn't how it has to be, right? Like, and there's not some about me that has made me this way or that has made us this way. It is, in fact, you know, as they pointed out, like, the result of structures and systems that have built these communities to exist in the way that they do.
And let me clarify, when I was saying, like, bring it down to the local level, I wasn't saying like these concepts are too broad that these kids are like not able to get it.
Oh, no, I know you weren't. I'm saying.
Okay, I just want to clarify.
Yeah. I'm saying them.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So I have to say that one of the things I'm thinking about as you're speaking, as I mentioned before, how do I take these kinds of messages and talk about this with my young daughters? And so I'm always concerned about my girls, about women in the movement. And that is one of the things I wanted to focus on in this discussion, especially because we have Leah and Kyra who are such leaders in our community. So what do you have to say about, the role of Black women in the movement for Black lives? How can we use our platforms to protect and support Black women at the intersections of justice, incarceration, and the Black Lives Matter movement?
We can start.
Yeah.
Talking about, oftentimes Black women are erased. I feel like our thoughts and our ideas, our aesthetic is stolen. So one simple way, a few simple ways that you could just support the work that we do in the movement, or just support Black women, period, is to amplify our voices, amplify and cite us, and lift up the work that we do. And also, our deaths. Breonna Taylor, I am blown away by the amount of support that she is finally getting, and it took a push for the organizers in Louisville, Chanel and them in Louisville, the Black women in Louisville, to push to get Breonna's name out there. But a few years ago, no one showed up for Rekia. Rekia Boyd was killed, or not too long after, Mike Brown and all these other people were killed, and people did not show up in mass the way they are doing now. So I'm very happy at the turnout for Breonna Taylor, but we need to keep going. We need to hear about the Black women who are also suffering at the hands of white supremacy. We need to hear about the Black women who are also incarcerated. The majority of literature that comes out of people who are incarcerated comes from men, or is amplified. The male voices who are incarcerated are by men, but there are women who are writing stories about their experiences about being incarcerated, and we aren't hearing from them. So amplify the voices of Black women, lift up trans Black women, protect them, not just online, but make sure that everything you do in your everyday life, it's natural, very natural for you to protect Black women that you're not even necessarily connected to, not just your wife, not just your sister, but all of us, and to make sure that, we check our internalized respectability. Black women don't have to dress a certain type of way or look a certain type of way for us to receive accolades. Even Black women who aren't necessarily on an IU panel, or Black women who may not ever become published, every Black woman at every level needs to be represented and uplifted and cited, and make sure that, we hear about Fannie Lou Hamer, just as much as we hear about, Martin and all these other people who are powerful, but there are many Black women who are just as powerful, Black women who are often not, the stereotypical label of beauty, they're not light-skinned, they aren't thin, but they are just as beautiful, just as powerful as the many wonderful Black men that we have out here doing the work. Let's talk about Marsha P. if we're going to talk about any other Black person doing the work for justice.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Leah said. Black women are fighting on the front lines, every single day. Another way to protect Black women is get out there and protect us from whatever harm comes our way when we're out there protesting, we're out there speaking. A Black woman was just killed. A couple of activists was just killed last month. Just things like that, making sure that we are protected at all times, because we are the ones doing this work, and we're the ones putting our faces out there, and we're the ones, like I said, on the front lines in front of white supremacy, getting hit with tear gas and rubber bullets. We were just in front of white nationalists, guns in our face, just stuff like that. And it's nothing but Black women holding it down. So yeah, protect Black women is the most, protecting them by any means necessary in real life, not just online, but on the front lines as well.
And capitalism is a bitch, but just make sure that Black women are paid. We are doing this work. We are writing phenomenal articles. We're doing research, and I feel we aren't getting paid the same amount that we should be. We still make less than Black men and white women.
Yeah.
And that's not fair, and that's not justice, and that's not equity.
And childbirth, when it comes to childbirth and reproductive rights, like Black women are at the bottom. And nobody talks about that either. So like Leah said, amplifying Black voices and protecting Black women. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. I think Michael had something he wanted to say.
Yeah, well, I was gonna just say that they should be the ones who speak first on that issue. But I always say, like, imagine if Black people protected their women like white supremacy has protected its women, right? Like when you think about like what started the civil rights movement is like they just believed a random woman, Carol Bryant, when she said a dude whistled at her, right? Yeah. And imagine if we believed our women, if we heard our women, if we protected them like that, right? Like we could have a strong response to white supremacy, right? Just imagine all the number of Black people who were lynched because of something that a white woman said, right? Like, why don't we protect our women like that? Because like that is a key to protecting our families, is protecting and protecting our culture, is protecting our women. And the other thing is, like when we talk about incarceration, we talk about the men who are incarcerated, and we kind of leave out the fact that there are people who are in fact affected by incarceration that aren't ever in prison, right? Like just the families who those men belong to, right? The children, their wives and their mothers and their girlfriends, like those are the people who are as impacted by, because sometimes like the system is going to at least give those men like a loaf of bread and some oodles of noodles to eat at night. But then like those women are missing that earning power, that protection, that those men are guarded by armed guards, and then the women are out there by themselves. So we have to also recognize that, like when we talk about incarceration or any system under the system of white supremacy, it affects women like twofold. First of all, just because they're women, and then because they're Black, and they have been the ones who have been kind of carrying us on their backs since we got here in 1619. So I think this is important to center them, because the other thing is that like I never really understood like it doesn't harm a men to focus on the center women, because ultimately it centers us, right? And so I think those are the important things that we have to recognize when we're talking about the movement for Black lives.
I'm glad you said that. I always say cities have burned for white women, have burned to the ground. I'm like, what will y'all burn for Black women? Like, what will y'all do away with for us?
Cities have burned, wars have been fought.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
People have died.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only thing I would add, as you know, is that it is also important to recognize the sort of heterogeneity of Black women, right? That like Black women are not all the same. As I mean, it's silly that it even needs to be said, but I think that so often we can, but in some ways good faith, in some ways bad faith, make Black women into a caricature of themselves, as if every Black woman is the same, every Black woman has the same politics, every Black woman has the same disposition, every Black woman has the same way of moving through the world. It is not true. Black women in the same, just like Black men, just like white men, just like white women, just like any group of people, have a plurality of experiences and views and perspectives and additional identities that shape how they move throughout the world. And you know, the experience of a Black trans woman is unique to the experience of someone else, and even the experience of Black trans women within the Black trans community. You can't say that all Black trans women are the same or want the same things or have the same ideas. So I think it's also just important on a human level for us to not fall into the trap of thinking that like all, even when, because there's a tension, because there's power in the communal aspect of it, right? There is power in a recognition that Black women as a community are like, they vote at the highest rates, they are the ones who throughout, you know, our history in this country, as Michael said, have like been the ones who have carried this country on their back, on its back, even though they shouldn't have to, right? Like that should not be the expectation of any group of people. But so we can at once recognize the power of the collective, but also not impute homogeneity onto a sort of collective and recognize that you got a lot of different folks who move in a lot of different ways. And that's a beautiful thing.
Oh my goodness. Can I just say, I hope this is not the last time I talk with all of y'all, because I am just loving this. So I really appreciate everything you've said so far. It's actually time for us to move to questions from Facebook. So, you know, I got to put my questions on the shelf, and that's all right. I have to read it from my phone, just a little bit of transparency here. The question is, can you talk some more about the relationship between our prison system and the economic system? The question goes on to say, the fact that we spend so much to incarcerate people doesn't make sense until we factor in the fact that we're artificially lowering unemployment figures by keeping the incarcerated out of the labor market, and the incarcerated provide a lot of free or underpaid labor.
Right, but yeah, we also like, so I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but like also we incarcerate a lot of consumers, right? So, you know, we're keeping them out of the labor market, but we're keeping them out of the group of consumers who consume goods and services that, you know, keep our economy going. So, you know, that's one aspect of it. And the other thing is that it is important to recognize that it is a very inefficient way economically to run a country, right? That's why we spend an outsized proportion of our money on incarcerating people who, had they been free, would not hurt anyone because they've never hurt anyone. And it's important, like, again, we incarcerate people for property crimes. We incarcerate people for drug. I remember once, so I was in John Jay gathers this group of fellows every year, and each year they talk about a certain specific topic, and it's a week-long group of seminars. And there was a federal judge one day talking about the criminal justice system, and he says, you know, and of course, I think probably all the panelists know this, that white people use as much drugs as Black people. And then when you remove marijuana from the situation because it's being legalized so much, like, white people use more of the other drugs than Black people. But Black people are 3.5 times more likely to be incarcerated for drugs. And one of the judges had an interesting remark that I can never forget. He says, because Black people sell drugs outside and white people sell drugs inside. And all that is a function of how lazy police are. If they could drive by your house and arrest you, then why would they conduct an expensive investigation and put up wiretaps and all? They can just drive down the street. And so the function of poverty informs the carceral system, informs the criminal justice system. And we think, well, they're targeting Black people. They just lazy, bro. Like, that is how America is built. Like, Black people, a lot of Black people live in poverty, and they do what capitalists do to get out of poverty. And then that reflects itself into our criminal justice system. So we can't forget, when we talk about any part of America and America's system of oppression, is that it exists in a larger system of capitalism. It is profitable to put people in jail, for some people, for private prison corporations, for people who make the uniforms, for people who have jobs as officers in prisons, and who make the food, who sell the food. They pay more for a prison meal than most of us pay for our meals that we eat every day. And it's because they're not spending their money, they're spending our money. So all of this exists within a larger system of capitalism that we can't forget. And capitalism is the same system that allowed white people to say, hey, we won't pay you for the first, I don't know, again, it's either 89 years or 246 years that America existed, simply because we just don't want to, because it's more money in it.
Anyone else want to
Yeah,
answer?
I mean, I just say that I think what's important to remember is sometimes we can make private prisons the boogeyman, right? And we can say that private prisons are like the reason that the carceral state is as massive as it is. Mass incarceration is as much of a problem as it is because we have all these private prisons. I want to be clear, private prisons are egregious. And like the idea that you would have institutions that make money from housing as many people as possible, as cheaply as possible, for as long as possible, clearly runs counter to any notion of restoration or justice that we as a society should abide by and believe in. What's also true is that private prisons are only like 8 or 9% of all prisons across the country. There are far more many quote unquote public prisons that are that have private entities entangled in them, right? So like it's private companies that make the food. It's private companies that make the toilet paper. It's private companies that often are contracted out for the correctional officers. It's private companies that make the, come in to fix the air conditioning, all kind of stuff, right? Like on a really granular level. And I think that we have to consider the larger economic infrastructure that prisons lift up and maintain, and how many people have a vested interest in continuing to be the contractors for these institutions, right? It's not, we always hear the number 2.3 or 2.2 million people incarcerated in prison and jail, but a more accurate number, I think, is that like there are 11 million people cycling in and out of jail every single year, and about 1.6 million, 1.5 million in state and federal prison. And so there, I mean, there's millions of people, there's millions of meals, millions of rolls of toilet paper, millions of toothpaste, millions of toothbrushes, all of this stuff. And then beyond that, you have towns across this country whose economic infrastructure relies, in some places, singularly on the prison as an institution, right? Like you have a prison in some of these rural towns where the people in prison, their bodies count toward the population of the town, even though these people don't have the opportunity to vote, right? And so, as prison gerrymandering is what it's referred to as. And so, you have folks there might not be, the factory might have shut down because, we're talking about capitalism and globalization. The factory in that town might have shut down. The Walmart might have closed. The whatever had been for so many decades the economic backbone of that place now has been replaced in some ways by an institution that gives this town its jobs, right? And then the politicians in those districts are not accountable to the people in those prisons, even though they benefit from the amount of people who are held there. And so there's all sorts of ways that like our economic system is entangled in our criminal legal system. And those are just a few.
So I have a follow-up question then. Can you all help me understand, when we're talking about economics, what's the connection between the discussion of defunding the police and incarceration?
So when people say defund the police, right? I think first of all, it's important to understand the definition of defund means to reduce funding, right? So they don't mean getting rid of all policing in America or just not paying attention to crime, right? There are a lot of things that we defunded but continued to focus on. We defunded the part of our government that printed paper food stamps. but people still get EBT cards, right? We defunded the part of our printing program that sent out. Remember, we used to get, y'all probably too young, we used to get tax booklets every year where you had to like literally add, and then we'd stop doing it. And it didn't mean we didn't have to pay taxes, right? Because it was a stupid way when you have a better way it was a stupid way to continue doing just because we've been doing it all the time. And that's what we're saying about police. And this is also important to know that when we talk about defunding the police, we're talking about stopping police from doing the stuff that police don't want to do anyway, right? Police don't want to do like mental health checks. Why do we send men with guns to people who are having a mental health episode? Police unions will tell you, like, we don't want to be doing that. We don't want to be basically the security force for these gated communities. Why are we doing that? We don't want to be EMT people. We don't want to rescue cats out of trees. We send police to do all kinds of things that they don't need to do. Why do we have police deal with the homeless, right? Why do we have police deal with the gangs instead of people who are experienced in dealing with youth and mental health? Like, there are so many things that police don't need to be doing that we could take that money that we give the police force to do and use it to pay people who are actually experienced and educated in those areas, right? So defunding the police is a better way to do it because, again, if you started to build a system from scratch right here today, we wouldn't have, you'd think I was crazy if you say, well, how are we going to handle the mental health? I don't know, just send the dudes with the guns. That's a dumb idea, right? So we can, like, as we're going through a reckoning, why not just handle all that stuff now, right? Why not just take that money and give it to people who know what they're doing? That is the idea of defunding the police. It is actually a smart idea because, again, we know prisons don't work and the way we police doesn't work in the way it is constructed now.
Say when we say defund the police, we absolutely mean just that. We feel like they need to be done away with. We do not feel like they are useful. But we understand that that cannot happen overnight. I believe in a just transition. So right now, let's take away this and place money over here. I agree with what Michael said. You know, we don't need to send people with guns to people who are having a mental health crisis. Our FOP here, their slogan for our police is, what is it?
Comply now, complain later.
Comply now, complain later. And that came after a 25-year-old mentally ill man was shot and killed by the police here, you know? So they absolutely are not equipped to handle these situations. So I feel like the way it connects with incarceration, like over 40% of the population of incarcerated people are mentally ill. If we had got to these people before the police did, they wouldn't be incarcerated, you know? If we had services to provide people with trauma, like therapy, when they were traumatized as children, you know, they wouldn't be in the predicament they are in now. We had given their parents the resources that they needed to have to make over a living wage, to have the food and the healthcare and the time off that they needed to have to live a life that was healthy and sustainable, these people wouldn't have experienced some of the trauma and some of the stress that they had that landed them in prison, like on top of like all the other things that lands people in prison, like white supremacy, you know? So absolutely, when we say defund the police, we mean that. We want to take money from this system that is not useful, that is not helpful, that is actually very harmful to people, and place it in the hands of people and organizations that can protect people before it gets to a place where it's a criminal act.
Never tried it. So we do need to try to defund the police. There's militarized weapons. Our police department, when we were having the protest, like there was expired tear gas used on us. And that's just money that could have been put in the community. They have militarized trucks, like things they don't absolutely need. That money can be taken away from them. Like they have a helicopter that they don't even use. And that money can be put back into the community. All these things, the police do not need these things. Who are you at war with? And that's a question that I ask all the time, like, who are you at war with? Why do we have all these, why do we have these militarized weapons? Why do we have this? Why do we have that? So taking that funding away and putting it in the community, it has to work. There's no other choice, but it's going to work. And they just need to listen.
I think it's important to to hear what they said, right? Because what they're saying is, like, it's like, just think about what she said, right? Take that money away from the police and put it into the community, because the community doesn't consider the police a part of us, right? Right. So you're saying, like, the money, like, if it was a just world, right? Right, and police were doing their jobs, no one would say, we'll take the money from stopping crime and protecting us and give it away to the people who are on drugs. That's not what people are saying, right? Because they know that the force that opposes them is the police. The police are not a part of the community, right? So that money that is going to the police, it is important to say, like, it ain't like people are saying, let's take money from the police because we don't want to give them money. We don't want, like, it is a better way to use that money, and it is a dumb way to use it in the way that we are using now, because, again, it does not protect people. Right. It does not stop crime. So why are we spending the money this way? And it doesn't have to be anti-police. It is a dumb way to do business.
I mean, I think only thing I would add, I think they're all right, is that some people really take for granted what providing people with, not even basic, because I think oftentimes we use the language of, like, to give people their basic needs. Don't give people their basic needs. Give them the resources that allow them to have full, just, and, like, thriving lives. Like, if you give people access, like, guaranteed housing, a job that's, like, not even $15 an hour is, like, what so many unions have been fighting for a long time, but, like, $15 an hour still isn't, in most cities across this country, a living wage, right? Like, you give people an actual living wage, you give people actual guaranteed healthcare, actual guaranteed housing, actual guaranteed access to mental health services, actual, like, meaningful resources and investment in schools and in the teachers and in the sort of larger social infrastructure of those schools, instead of doing all these things, like, a little bit over here and a little bit over there, but then taking it away when it doesn't work according to the Excel metrics that you put in your spreadsheet. And, like, I think it is so important. Folks who have those things can really take for granted how not having those things would create a sense of desperation, create a sense of distress, create a sense of constant, ongoing, perpetual anxiety in your body that would make you do things that other people would call irrational, when it's actually, like, very human, because you are responding to what your body is telling you. Like, it's saying, I need these things and I am not getting them. And the reason they are not getting them is because, like, our government, our municipal, state, and federal governments could very easily make a different set of choices. I say it all the time, right? Like, poverty is a choice. Poverty is a public policy choice in this country. And it does not have to be that way. We don't even have time to get on my, like, I think debt is made up, and, like, we don't even have to, it's not even, like, about, like, reallocating. Like, you could just give the community organizations the money that they need just because, like, you know, capitalism is a thing we created and it's made up. And this idea that, like, we can't give people enough money to feed themselves because our debt is going to increase. Some things are only real because we tell ourselves that it is real. And, you know, I think we see that on a national level where, like, suddenly nobody cares. You know, the Republicans came in and they were like, debt, like, look at our national debt, look at our national debt, and then increased the national debt more than the previous administration to levels that we haven't seen before. But then as soon as, you know, God willing, different administration comes in, I guarantee you when that happens, they're going to be like, what about the debt? What about the debt? And they're going to use that as justification to cut programs federally, on state levels, and on municipal levels. So yeah, it just give people what they need. And so many of these issues disappear, right? Just give people the things that they need. And it's that simple, but for years and for years and for years, we have consistently failed to do so.
Yeah, I wrote a piece about how this COVID situation has kind of unmasked America. And one of the things is, it's like, we are here talking about these things, right, as if they are abstract, progressive ideas that no one on the right would even consider. But then when we were in a quandary, right, a month ago, they said, hey, why don't we just give people money? Like that would help everybody out because, you know, people are going to be sick and people are going to be out of work. Why don't you just give them money so our economy won't break down? And everybody agreed that that was a good idea, right? And so they knew the solution the entire time. It's not like we're thinking these progressive liberal ideas and I'm in the basement brainstorming and coming up with ideas that no one has ever thought of. These are widely accepted views. It is just that the system of capitalism depends on there being have-nots as much as it depends on there being people who have, right? And so you have to, and that's not like a conspiracy thing, right? Like there are still senators and politicians out there arguing now, like, well, if we give people $600, they won't go to work. $600 more a week, they won't go to work. You doggone right. Like, why would somebody go to work in the middle of a pandemic for somebody who only cares enough about them to give them $600 a week? Like, this is a stupid thing that the people who have the power to give them money would never go to work for $600 a week, right? They would never risk their lives for $600 freaking a week. And they're arguing over that because their only position is, well, what if they don't do what we want to do? What if I can't order a pizza? Or what if I can't go get my nails done? It's not like we're coming up with brainstormed new ideas from a think tank. These are widely accepted views by people on the right who already know their work. They work, and when they're in a tough position, they will institute them too. They just don't want to do it, and you have to ask yourself, why not?
Wow, this conversation has been amazing. I promised you that this was going to be Black excellence, this was going to be dynamic, and we absolutely delivered this evening. We have more questions, but we are running out of time. I said at the beginning of the event that I wanted to challenge folks to understand how Indiana fits into this national conversation about the movement for Black lives. So before I wrap us up, I'm gonna actually pass the mic to Leah and Kyra and ask if you have some closing remarks about your movement, about your work in Indianapolis and in Indiana to kind of take us home.
I would say it's been almost 3 months since Dre John, Reed, and Mikkel Rose was killed 24 hours apart. The family of Dre John still doesn't have the autopsy report. Mikkel Rose's family does not have any type of 911 calls, any type of anything from the police stating why he was shot the way he was shot. And I just want people to know, like, imagine your child getting killed by someone you pay to protect you, and they don't give you any answers on why he was killed or why anything. They feel like you don't deserve the answers. And we're still out here fighting. You might not see us on the ground every day, but we are fighting at a local level with politicians, writing letters, protesting, emailing, calling, and all the emailing, calling is working. The city councilman said that they were getting thousands of emails a day, so please keep emailing people and calling. But they have not recommended officers to be fired, and that needs to happen before they can indict the officers.
Yeah, like Kyra said, go to our Facebook page and our Twitter and our Instagram to push those demands. We need for you to screenshot, reshare, retweet. We post the demands. We ask people to call and email. We need the officers to be fired. We need for them to be held accountable. And we need justice for these 2 young men who were killed within 8 hours of each other. We need for the FOP contract to be, the negotiations, which are up in August, we need for them to be made public. We need for the public to have input on the FOP negotiations. Also, what were you saying? Okay, I thought you said something, sorry. We also just need for people to push our demand for the budget. You know, the budget session is coming up. You know, we have demands to reallocate funds from IMPD and place them in the hands of community. Always, our PayPal is paypal.me/Indy10people. My Cash App is Leah, Dr. H. I am not a doctor. I'm not a PhD candidate. Those are just my initials. So Leah, Dr. H.
Mine is Kyra J 22. We are always willing to accept gas money, food, anything. But thank y'all for supporting us the last 6 years. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. So Leah, Kyra, Clint, Michael, this has been an absolute honor for me. I've been starstruck the entire time. I thank you so much for all the wonderful things you've given us to think about. There are more questions on Facebook, so I just invite you to continue engaging with the folks that tuned in. There will be a recording and other ways for people to engage with this topic, but then also to find you in your social media and to continue learning about your work. So thank you so much for making time to be with us and for all the thought-provoking comments you've made. With that, I think it's about time for us to wrap up, unless anybody has any last comments.
Just grateful to Leah and Kyra for y'all's work, and deeply appreciated. Obviously, I know the Indianapolis and Indiana community appreciate it, but we out here on the East Coast appreciate it very much too.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Such an honor.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.